Three Apache sisters bent over a heat-bleached body while a dead windmill skeleton cast a broken cross on the dust. Noon glare burned the basin flat. Nothing moved except a strip of red cloth whipping from the lowest steel vein. The drifter lay half in its shadow, half in white blaze, as if the land had not decided whether to keep or discard him. His lips were split to raw threads. A dark crust of blood sealed the hole high in his thigh, where a small-caliber round had taken more water than flesh. Flies traced loops over salt-dark shirt creases. Tala reached him first. Tallest, shoulders roped thin, two long braids swinging down a back sun-browned to copper. She knelt, let her palm hover above his mouth, feeling the thready warmth of a life anchored shallow. With the other hand, she lifted his eyelid. Pupil slid, but did not fix. She shifted, angling her own shadow across his face so he would not wake into a sheet of flame. Nay arrived quiet, knees folding under her like a dancer's. She wore bone pendants that clicked softly in the dry heat, each sound accounting. From a rawhide pouch, she drew a narrow strip of dried venison. She softened one end with her saliva, scraped slivers, placed them near his mouth. His cracked lips did not open. She did not force. She just left the meat resting, as a promise anchored in salt. Suni, smallest and fastest, brought water. A gored skin, sides caved, lighter than it should be. She had run a broken mile for that scoop. A seep under chalk stone, not yet clawed dry by cattle. She pressed the lip of the gourd to his mouth, letting one drop fall. It slid along a fissure and vanished. Second drop. Third. On the fourth, his throat spasmed, a swallow that seemed to start his chest again. His hand twitched toward a leather satchel still buckled beneath him. Tala unfastened the straps. Inside, a folded scrap of oilcloth, a coil of thin iron rod, a handful of small bolts wrapped in cloth black with grease, and a paper stiff with dried sweat. Rough sketch lines of a vertical shaft, blade arms, a pump rod, arrows showing rotation. Notes scrawled in a hand that leaned forward like someone walking in a headwind. She glanced to the windmill stump, its head frozen, two blades broken, tail twisted. She slid the drawing back, understanding the grammar of salvage and need. Heat shimmered. On the north ridge, a fence line sagged in dead intervals. Beyond that, empty earth until wavy sky. The stillness felt like a held breath one gust could turn to flame. Tala lifted her chin, scanning for dust plumes that would mean riders. Nothing yet. The emptiness did not comfort. Too much sky could hide trouble easier than hills could. They debated with glances. Tala's jaw. Leave him and keep moving toward the arroyo her memory said still held water under its crust. Nay's soft brow. Stay. They could not outrun the hunger, twisting Jonah silent in her own belly-still months after winter sickness took what it started. Suni's flared nostrils. Move. Soldiers sometimes followed wounded men like ants to sweat salt. The drifter's fingers began to close around nothing, then opened. Tala removed the ragged bandana from his neck, folded it into a pad, pressed above the wound to slow seep. She drew a bone all from her belt, heated it with a magnified lens of clear quartz she carried for fire-making. Once red, she let it cool to temper, then scraped crust free, cleaned edges with a scrap of boiled buckskin. Not to heal, just to keep rot from choosing for them. They slung him using his own bedroll as a sling. Tala and Nay took the weight. Suni scouted ahead in widening half circles, reading sign. No fresh hoof, only antelope split prints days old. The abandoned ranch sprawled a quarter-mile west. A barn leaning like a tired knee, a trough dry to cracked planks, the pump rod locked mid-stroke by rust scar like a cauterized vein. A single scrap of tin roof lifted and settled with each light gust, sounding like a slow heartbeat. They carried him inside the barn's shade, where hay long since turned to gray straw still offered less heat than open air. Suni spread a woven reed mat she'd rescued weeks before from a burned wickiup. They lowered him. His breath rattled like a bead rolled in a hollow gourd. From his satchel, she pulled a small tin of darkened salve, sniffed, bear grease and pine pitch. Useful. Nay warmed a little in her palm, and laid it along the wound margins, sealing edges, trapping what moisture they could. Hours thinned. The sun's arc slid, and the wind freshened enough to turn one surviving windmill blade half a degree, then back. Each click, faint, registered under Tala's ribs. Twilight would bring colder air, but also distant voices traveling sharper. They needed water now, or they would sleep dry-mouthed and wake dizzy. Soon he vanished low toward the ridgeline, following a faint green trace of saltbush. She returned at dusk with a heavier gourd, calves shaking. Mud streaked her legs. The seep had dropped. She had dug. She set the gourd down. Her palms showed crescent cuts where she had clawed clay. She grinned anyway, defiance burning past fatigue. They rationed. 3 swallows each sister, 6 for him. Tala tilted his head, fingers at his throat to feel the swallow. Nay counted. Soon he held her own breath until he took each one. After, he shivered, a fine tremor unlocking stale heat. Fever could build or break. Hard to tell yet. Night entered without permission. Crickets tuned. A coyote yipped far east, no answer. Nay tore a narrow strip from her underdress hem, twisted it into cord, and bound his satchel closed again. She placed a small shard of yesterday's acorn cake by his hand. Beside it, a crust of coarse ground maize she had saved unknowingly for this. When he woke, the choice would sit plain, take and crawl, or accept and stay. Bread beside him, and a map of what they would offer if he chose the second path. Tala climbed the interior ladder to the loft cutout and lay facing the gap in wall boards to watch for dust wakes of riders. Soon he curled near the man's feet, knife in fist, trusting her light sleep more than the barn's slant walls. Nay rested with her head near his shoulder to feel the rise pattern. The drifter lay between, fixed in a compass of strangers who had decided, without ceremony, to invest night into a life offering nothing back yet but broken metal and a drawing. Just before true dark he surfaced. Eyes opened, washed-out gray film confused. He saw the ceiling first, then turned his head a handspan and saw the bread crust, the meat sliver, the coil of iron. His gaze tracked the semicircle of 3 faces watching without leaning in. His hand lifted, hovered over the bread, then withdrew and instead reached, shaking, to the satchel. He pulled the folded paper, fumbled it open, tried to tap the sketch lines, then the dead pump outside, then the one blade caught and freed by fitful wind. His finger traced the arrow indicating rotation, then faltered. Tala nodded once. She reached for a fallen length of 8-penny nail. She struck it against the stone until one end squared cleaner, then held it up where lamplight, her embers shielded in dry grass, threw a lean shadow. The drifter's cracked mouth formed a ghost of a scent. Outside, the wind freshened a notch, turning the blade another fraction. That faint creak tilted something invisible toward possibility. The barn inhaled with the cooled night air. He sank back, breath thin but steadying. Nay placed the venison scrap against his lip. This time his tongue moved, tasting salt and smoke. It did not speak a welcome. The bread lay where he could reach it when he owned the choice. Overhead, a strip of stars slid through the gap like a slow river. Inside, for breaths found a cadence that laced strangers into a provisional pattern strong enough to hold until dawn's verdict. Dawn bled thin silver through the barn's east seam, painting a pale bar across the drifter's face. His eyes opened into it instead of flinching. Bread still sat by his palm. He lifted it, turned it once as if weighing not the grain but the terms attached, and set it down intact. Then he lifted the venison shard and chewed slow, making it last past its size. Choice made. He would take what asked nothing but staying present. Tala climbed down from the loft, knees clicking soft. She touched 2 fingers to the wound packing, checking seep. Dark stain had not widened in the night. Edge warmth remained, fever not spiked yet. She wiped cracked lips with the back of her wrist, at once a private gesture and signal. Nay read it, fetched the gourd, shook it. Hollow slosh. Their ration calculus had already shifted. One more mouth meant searching beyond the seep's clawed basin. Soon he slipped out before full light, shoulders angled low to cut wind, carrying 2 empty gourds, a bone spoon, and stubbornness. Tala watched until the girl shrank to a moving dot near the saltbush line, then turned back to work forming under the same roof a hurt man tried to breathe through. The drifter motioned for the satchel. Tala passed it. His fingers trembled but steadied once they found familiar weight. He spread the drawing on a plank, smoothed one corner. The paper had once been ledger scrap. Faint blue lines ghosted beneath charcoal. He tapped the sketch of the head assembly, then pointed toward the dead windmill outside and mimed rotation with a raw hinge of wrist. His other hand sought a small bolt, held it up, then opened his palm in a question. More? Tala answered with empty hands and lifted shoulders. If there were more, they lay under sand somewhere his memory felt, but his body could not fetch yet. Nay tore a thread from her own sash, teased it double, threaded a bone needle, and set about reworking the torn seam of his shirt where the bullet had entered, not for beauty, but to lay edges flat, so they would not chafe infection deeper. Her fingers had once knotted cradle ties. Now they closed a stranger's cloth with the same measured care. Each drawn stitch tightened what loose shock had left ragged. Heat climbed early. Flies thickened. Tala built a slow spiral of dried dung chips on a flat shard and coaxed a smoke coil with Sunni's quartz lens. The bitter stream draped over the man's legs, discouraging wings. He watched the smoke, tracking its pull into the barn's small currents, and pointed to a gap where rising heat escaped. Tala understood draft airflow, even his half-breath thought and structure. Sunni returned mid-morning, gait staggered by gourd weight. Mud crusted her knees again, this time dotted with flecks of broken root she'd clawed out to deepen the seep. She tipped precious water into the trough's cleanest corner. Tala rationed it with a gourd dipper. First the wounded, then each sister, then a small remainder pooled for boiling. They dropped a pinch of ground mesquite bean meal into the warm water, stirred until a thin paste formed, and pressed it against the drifter's cracked lips. He swallowed, some of the grit catching at the corner. He did not cough it away. He lifted a hand, palm up, fingers curled as if grasping something long absent. He pointed to Tala's belt. She unhooked a length of rawhide lace. He shook his head faintly, then reached to his own satchel and withdrew a narrow leather strap, darker, worn smooth by years of sweat. He pushed it toward her with small insistence. Gift, Tala frowned. Giving up a strap in desert lean made little sense. He tapped the drawing's mast, then the strap, then mimed binding. Not gift, material for the work that would return water. She accepted it, laying it reverent across a beam. That was the first thing he surrendered, he could not easily replace. By midday, his fever ridge sharpened. Sweat slicked his temple, then cooled too fast as breeze tunneled under warped slats. Nay laid a damp strip across his brow, changed it when heat bled through. Sunni pounded prickly pear pads, pressed the pulp into a cloth, and bound it loosely above the wound to draw heat. Tala sat still, saving motion until something only she could do emerged. When his shivers deepened, he whispered a word, raw, shaped oddly, like the back end of English hit by desert dryness. They could not catch it. He stopped, lips blue at the edges. Then he did what required less water than speech. Crooked a finger in dust beside him and traced a crude spiral, then 4 short spokes radiating at uneven intervals. He tapped the spiral, then their 3 faces, then his own chest. Whatever tribe names had left, he built a placeholder with geometry. Tala nodded and retraced the shape deeper, so it would remain if delirium scraped it away later. Shadow shortened and flattened. Outside the pump rod gleamed dull where rust had not crusted. Sunni prodded its base with a stick. Iron resisted in a stubborn block. The drifter saw and lifted both hands, palms parallel, then mimed lifting and dropping rhythm. He repeated, slower, then pointed at his chest, then at the rod. He wanted to try soon. Tala's mouth thinned. The wound would tear. But purpose could do what broth could not. She said nothing and did not forbid. Late afternoon, he signaled readiness by trying to sit. Nay braced his back. Tala gripped under his good arm. Sunni slid the reed mat to give purchase. He rose half, face blanching to bone under sun-browned skin. Heat spots flicked by his vision. He leaned into them until they passed. They got him standing, weight on good leg, the other trailing a fraction. He took 2 breathless steps to the barn mouth and stared at the warped blades. Outside air lay on him like a new weight. He lifted his hand, fingers closing around empty space where the pump handle would have rested if not stuck. He mimed motion again. Tala shook her head once, then relented, hands open. Try carefully. He grasped the rod sleeve, pulled. Rust held. He exhaled through clenched teeth, set jaw, and lifted again with what little muscle fever had not emptied. A faint scrape answered. Flake of iron oxide fell like burnt scale. He almost laughed. A cracked ghost of sound. The rod rose an inch, then dropped. Pain dragged a groan past his control. Tala steadied him back. Enough. He did not fight the retreat, spent. Inside he lay again, chest laboring. Suni, face shining with dust-salted sweat, unwrapped the prickly poultice, replaced it with fresh, cool pulp. Nay folded the blood-crusted bandana a new way to pad weight distribution. Tala examined his hands. New blistered skin over old rope callus. Workman's map. Not soldier. Not soft. A craft somewhere in the past still held his grip memory. Evening cooled, saving what water remained. Nay flattened a half-handful of ground corn and mesquite meal into a thin cake on a shard over coals. Scent drifted. She cut it in 4 even wedges. He watched distribution. She gave him one last. Equality louder than talk. Before sleep, he lifted his forefinger again and drew the spiral deeper at his side. Then he pointed to the pump, then to the coil of iron, then pressed his palm flat over the breadcrumb dust on the plank, as if sealing an agreement no one said aloud. Tala answered by placing the leather strap between the coil and drawing. Nay laid the bone needle across them. Soon he set the empty gourd mouth down, meaning, fill together or not at all. Night settled less harsh. A breath of moving air stirred the hanging pendant Nay had woven from stray horsehair for Suni. Its faint sway marked time better than stars. For pulses in shadow, aligned to that rhythm. Outside a blade ticked half a degree again, then quieted, storing in that stillness the next day's labor. They slept on the edge of thirst and intent, a balance the desert respected long enough for morning to test whether purpose can outpace fever. He did not reach for the bread. It waited, and its untouched presence marked something firmer than hunger, the choosing of them over hoarding. And in that small restraint, a scaffolding of trust set its first brace. Morning arrived with the taste of metal in the air, the kind of thin cool that means wind will rise before noon. The drifter woke before the sisters, eyes finding the spiral carved deeper. Dust settled into the grooves like pigment. Bread still lay where they had placed its remainder. He tapped it once, a silent tally point, then began inching himself upright without calling for help. Tala opened one eye, already measuring strain against gain. She let him try until tremor threatened to pull the wound open, then offered forearm. He took only enough. Outside, first light brushed the frozen windmill head in pale tin. Suni wedged a flat stone under the pump rod sleeve for leverage, while the others portioned morning water, thinner than yesterday. The seep would not wait on them. They would have to wait on it. They broke the night silence with a single half-hummed note, a tone she'd offered to fever dreams. It floated, then blended into wind hissing low through saltbush. Work began with freeing what held stillness hostage. The drifter pointed at a knot of rust near the rod guide. Tala fished a sliver of animal fat from a wrapped scrap and warmed it between her palms until it slicked. Nay touched its edge to the corroded seam. The fat smoked faint, darkening iron. Suni worked a bone wedge into the red scale, prying flakes as delicately as picked thorns. The drifter, limited to directing, did not fidget. His eyes traced contact points, counting silently which surfaces would accept motion first. When enough crust shed, Tala and Suni threaded the salvaged leather strap through 2 warped braces, creating a crude sling. At the drifter's nod, they pulled opposite ends in rhythm. Lift, hold, breathe, drop. On the 3rd cycle, the rod rose farther, 2 finger widths, then sank with a wet groan that was not just metal. Somewhere below, a pocket of trapped water shifted, then settled again. Sound of promise. The drifter closed his eyes against the surge of exhausted relief, as if the idea of success weighed as much as iron. They repeated until his jaw clenched white. They call halt by simply laying her palm over the spiral carve in dust, stilling all four bodies with that soft stop. They eased it back to shade. Sweat had dried salt into the edges of his wound wrapping. She moistened a scrap, lifted away crust carefully, relaying salve. The heat radiating from the muscle had receded a fraction. Purpose had leached fever, or her poultice had taken hold. Either reason sufficed. Midday heat shimmered. Suni left again for the seep, this time carrying a second shard to deepen the clawing. She returned with less water than the day before, mud thicker. Her eyes said the pocket was draining. The windmill had to work before the seep died, or four bodies would not hold until distant rain. Tala did not voice the shrinking window. She simply sharpened a sliver of bone to replace a worn wedge. The drifter signaled for the drawing, laid it over a plank. Using a fragment of charcoal from an old burned post, he redrew a section, adding cross-hatching to indicate friction points, then tapped a corner where a missing bolt would have set. He fumbled at his satchel, produced a short length of rod, and mimed snapping. Tala shook her head, too thick to break clean. He frowned in thought, then sketched a notch, tapped his own molars, made a twisting motion. Nay understood faster. File by chewing edge? Impossible. She instead produced the bone all heated days before, braced rod end in a crack, and began scoring a groove with patient, scraping passes. Time cost, an hour. Reward, a weakened point to leverage against flat stone until the rod surrendered into two halves neither perfect nor straight, but long enough to serve as replacement pins. They hammered each half through warped holes with a rock wrapped in a scrap of hide to blunt shock. The sound carried brittle across the basin. Tala paused after each strike, listening for echo not of metal, but of answering human movement. None came, only wind building, flicking the dangling blade fragment so it clattered irregular like scattered bones. Late afternoon brought the first true test. The drifter insisted on standing again, weight borne more by will than healed fiber. Tala tied a strip above the wound to reduce pull. He gripped the makeshift sling, ends with hands scab raw from previous efforts. Suni perched on the trough edge, ready to shout if lower piping showed seep. Nay positioned herself to catch him should his knee fold. Lift, Tala breathed. Not language for him, just sound for them. They heaved the strap in unified motion. Rod rose, complaining but obeying. They held, counted heartbeats, released. Dust puffed at the base. Again. On the fifth rise, a hollow cough echoed through the dry shaft. All of them froze, united by adrenaline at what it might mean. Tanneries of silence stretched, then a single dull thud below as if a loosened valve settled. One drop darkened the dust at the trough's lowest split. It sank quick, leaving a pinhole darker than the rest. The drifter almost sagged with the sight of a drop. A rational mind would call it nothing. A desert-bent mind called it axis shift. They placed her fingertip over the damp spot, lifted it to her tongue. Salt, iron, stale yet not poison. She smiled without showing teeth. Suni hooped once, a sharp hawk crack swallowed quick so it wouldn't fritter strength. They worked in slower interval sets until the rod's motion smoothed just enough to slide a palm's length with each cycle. No steady flow, but a thin ooze began leaking at seams, tracing runnels through fine powder. They guided it with small sticks into a depression they had scraped, pooling mud glossy. They dropped a pinch of ash to absorb surface taste, then left it settling while heat bled off the iron. Evening found all four wrecked. Tala outlined a shallow trench from the nascent puddle to the trough interior with the bone all, deepening enough that when flow thickened it would rout where they could defend it. The drifter, drained to marrow, lay back staring at the static blades, as if willing them to memorize the angle of a turning future. Nay baked a flat cake of mesquite meal and the last of the grinding corn they had carried tucked in a cloth tube, split into 4 equal pieces again. Suni insisted the drifter take the first piece this time. Gesture reversed to mark passage. He accepted, tearing it with care, so crumbs fell only where small ants could find weight. Before sleep, he motioned for Nay's needle, then for Suni's spare hair wrap, then the leather strap scrap left from the cut pins. With shaking hands, he threaded the needle with rawhide, drew 3 small stitches through the wrap to form a loop, tied it around his wrist, then tapped each sister's face and the loop. He tapped the strap holding the rod assembly, then the loop, mapping kinship through fiber and work. Tala, understanding the shape, but perceiving it needed grounding beyond his skin, took the bone awl and carved a shallow spiral into the indoor face of the pump base. Around it she scored 3 short ticks, unequal like them. Suni added a 4th tick, shorter and off-center, then looked at him. He nodded, him, but not centered yet. The hierarchy unspoken, honest. Night draped over a basin, now holding a stain of wet where none had been a dawn before. Crickets shifted song to a slightly fuller tone, drawn by change in moisture. The wind, stronger, set the one broken blade fragment shivering a steady rhythm. To tired ears it passed for the earliest ghost of spinning. He slept without fever leaps, only shallow dips in a semi-rest, breath pattern aligning to the faint tremor of a machine not yet alive. The sisters slept with hands nearer tools than knives. Their world pivoted on a drop the size of a lentil. But in scarcity, a lentil can balance 5 futures. The desert, impartial, simply held the weight they placed on it. Toward midnight, a distant coyote answered another. First call in return they had heard since finding him. Life traveled caution back into the basin. The drifter's fingers twitched as if gripping a handle. Outside, the rod exhaled a silent cool into dark, storing for tomorrow's drives. Trust, like water, had begun to seep, not a stream, but a wet shine proving the aquifer beneath would answer sustained effort. Wind arrived hard from the west, flattening sage, and bringing with it the far smell of horse sweat, not their own. Morning light found the pooled mud at the trough's lip thicker, a thumbprint-sized lens of water reflecting a slice of sky. Suni knelt, cupped both hands around that mirror as if shielding a candle. She whispered a fragment of a joke meant only to steady her own pulse, then let the lens go. It held, meniscus trembling. The drifter sat propped against a beam, color drifting back under fever pale. Overnight his breath had stayed in low, steady furrows, no sudden gulps. Now his eyes tracked the horizon shifts outside the barn door, measuring nothing the sisters could see yet. Tala followed his gaze, and at first registered only heat shiver. Then a faint thread of dust uncoiled on the far ridge, moving counter to wind push. Riders. They reacted like a muscle with 4 fibers. Suni slipped outside low, scanning for cover. Only the slump of the trough wall, the dead windmill mast, the partial shadow of a collapsed lean-to. Nate gathered the drawing and the pins, smearing fresh footprints near the pump base into busy indistinct churn. A confusion tactic. Tala checked the drifter's bandage. Crimson wept at edges from prior exertion. He lifted a hand, palm down, steady. Do not dismantle progress to hide. She understood. Windmill half-freed was the only argument they owned. Dust line thickened into 3, then 5, then 7 silhouettes. Not military line. Spacing loose, hats mismatched. Contract riders, maybe bounty men or scavengers following rumor of water rig salvage. The drifter's face hardened at the second from the left. A man who rode with shoulders pitched forward like a hawk leaning into glide. Recognition thinned his mouth. He tapped twice over his satchel, then drew a finger across his throat, not threat but memory. Those men's trade cut things off, water, breath, claim. Tala signaled silently, positions. She took a place just inside barn shade, body one line with door jam, presence less visible until someone committed to crossing threshold. Nay sat cross-legged near the trough, head bowed, looking like a girl at a chore, hands resting on knees but fingers flexed over a bone knife hidden along her palm. Suni climbed the windmill mast halfway, wedged in a cracked cross bracing like a small hawk, rawhide, sling coiled in hand. The riders reined in a dozen horse lengths from the barn. Their leader, hawk-shouldered, spat dark phlegm onto powder. He scanned the dead rig, the barn, the faint wet glint, the three slight figures, the fourth propped shape. His eyes narrowed at the drifter, surprise sliding into calculation. His voice came harsh from disuse. Water rights claim? Salvage? Reward for a man left unaffiliated? He rode closer, horse ears flicking at the scent of old rust and human lean desperation. The drifter did not answer with words. He lifted the drawing half so the rider could see, then lowered it, palm covering the spiral carved at his side. Hawk Shoulders laughed once, sound like splitting a dry plank, and said something about the man owing them iron, a plan, maybe a debt. He extended a hand as if inviting compliance. None inside moved. Pressure gathered not in sound, but in the stillness of 7 men balanced on choice. Tala shifted weight to balls of feet. The leader's gaze slid from the drifter to the sisters, dismissive until it snagged on Tala's face with a flash of recognition. She saw the memory cross his features. A night months back, her leading a small U.S. column along a ridge path to bypass a flooded ford. He had been trailing, using their military pace to cover his own pursuit. Shame pricked under her skin, not for saving depraved men, but for failing then to see their shadow use of her path. That unspoken history hung like cord between them. He smirked, shaping exposure as leverage. Tala answered by deliberately turning her back on him to adjust the pump strap, denying his hold. Dismissal cut his advantage. His mouth tightened. He flicked 2 fingers. 2 riders dismounted, boots pushing puffs of pale dust. They approached, eyes on the satchel and coil. Nay moved first, not with knife but with water. She dipped a small tin cup into the shallow mud, lifting not enough to drink, only enough to darken the cup's inner curve. She set it in front of the approaching boots like a ceremonial boundary. The men hesitated. The absurdity of so little water claiming sanctity on this dead patch unsettled momentum. Suni used that beat to swing her sling. The stone snapped air and shattered the nearer rider's canteen strap. Metal hit dust, contents bleeding precious dark stain. Horses smelled damp and shifted, nerves rising. Leader swore. He signaled a rush. Tala threw herself against the pump rod, giving it 3 heavy jerks. Each drop coaxed a fast, thin ooze from below, widening the glimmer at the trough lip. Nay seized a flatboard, scraped newly moist clay into a trench lip, building a low barrier. Suni loosed another stone past a horse's flank. The animal sidestepped, colliding with its neighbor, tangling reins. Chaos scrambled their tidy approach. The drifter, face drawn, forced himself upright, grasped the leather strap, and hauled in sync with Tala. Steel groaned. A coughing surge belched a thicker run of brackish water that spilled over the trough's inner edge. It streamed down the shallow trench Tala had scratched prior day, pooling in a channel that cut across the rider's line of sight. Mud spray flaring under hoof, obscuring lower legs like a curtain of earth. Hawk Shoulders pressed his mount forward, then checked hard as the horse's front hooves sank in fresh slick. In that stutter beat, Tala stepped fully into the doorway, body between rider and drifter, palms up empty. Suni whistled sharply from the mast. Coyote yip. Far off, as if answering, real coyotes took the call. The desert, indifferent, lent its voices to their bluff. Leader measured again. His men muttered. Wet mud on boots meant weight, meant sink, meant risk for no certain gain. The drifter's eyes did not leave his. Hawk Shoulders spat again, this time away from the water, and jerked his reins. He spoke a promise shaped like rust. He would be back when the wind turned, when the rig spun and drew clear. Then he wheeled. The others followed, one glancing back at the tiny pool as if it were a vein too thin to matter. Their dust plume unspooled away, thinning to a faint bruise on horizon. Silence crashed back. Tala kept still until dust settled enough to see ground detail again. Suni slid down mast, legs shaking. Nate exhaled all at once, breath fluttering the wet surface. The drifter sagged against beam, gray around the lips, but a tremor of triumph flickered under the exhaustion. They did not erupt. No whoops, no quick words. Instead, Nate dipped 2 fingers into the pooled water, wiped the mud stripe across Tala's forearm. Initiation reversed, a mark of shared defense. Suni pressed her palm in the edge of the new mud, lifted it, printing her hand over the spiral at pump base. The drifter extended his trembling hand. Tala guided it so his palm pressed into the damp layer, leaving a smudged impression between theirs. When he lifted it, a faint blood bead appeared where an old blister reopened and mixed with clay. Red traced into brown and disappeared. Dead accepted, not voiced. They rationed adrenaline into labor. Tala and Suni adjusted lashings the men's approach had jostled. They collected the displaced mud into a higher lip to trap more seep. The drifter's breath rattled once, shallow. Nay slid a wedge of baked meal to his mouth. He chewed like praying, eyes half-lidded. Through afternoon wind eased, heat deepened. No returning dust. Only a vulture's slow spiral far east. The drifter dozed in short falls, waking to each shift of shadow on Tala's profile as she scanned ridges. Suni repaired sling cords, weaving tighter pattern to absorb future strain. They scraped another thin cake's worth of meal from the bottom of the cloth tube, scraping sound like a cricket's rasp. Toward dusk, the rod's motion, guided now by Tala alone, began to produce a thin but continuous thread of water rather than intermittent sine coughs. It filled a groove the sisters had deepened into a narrow channel carving toward the trough. Flow still muddy, but silt would settle with sustained draw. The drifter watched until certainty lined his face. The mechanism would yield fully with cycles and care. He shifted, drew his fingertip through drying mud, and added a 5th, longer tick to the spiral cluster. A future mark, aspirational, right at his earlier short line. Tala left it unchallenged. Suni traced it, acceptance without ceremony. Night came easier, though each of them slept with muscle fibers humming leftover tension. The threat had not dissolved, it had only postponed. But they had defended a shallow sheen with nothing but geometry, withheld bread, a sling, thin deception of water sacredness, and labor-willed moisture. In desert arithmetic that measured as real gain. Stars returned in their coal numbers. Wind, spent, lowered to a soft run through the broken vein. In the barn, 4 bodies angled unconsciously toward the faint metallic ticking, as if aligning their inner pace to a machine half-born. The drifter's hand, even in sleep, curled loosely as though shaping an invisible handle he would one day grip without pain. Around the pump base, the overlapping prints dried into a map of an agreement no ink had recorded. Outside, a night insect landed on the new damp channel, tasted mineral, and stayed. Life will always test water first. The sisters had brought a stranger back to the line where such tests begin. He had answered not with speech, but with loosened rust and shared strap. Dawn would decide if that bargain held and what next price trust demanded. Dawn spread thin gold across a yard that no longer looked abandoned. Dark damp traced a ribbon from pump base to trough. A faint surface sheen reflected a sliced image of sky broken by the leaning mast. The wind came early, steady enough to nudge the freed blade stub in small obedient arcs. Each arc rubbed more rust from the guide. The rod's lift and fall adopted a rhythm Tala could match without wrenching muscle raw. The drifter woke before full light, hand already reaching to confirm the strap's position. Fever heat had ebbed to a warm residue. The wound edges lay flatter beneath salve. He hauled himself upright, refusing help until weight-bearing forced a hiss between teeth. Tala let him stand in the barn mouth alone for 3 breaths, an allowance that burned time and risk but paid in something weightless. He watched the rod cycle twice, eyes narrowing in assessment, then turned toward the broken head high above and pointed, shaping with fingers a rectangle. Panel, vein addition. More surface would catch wind, reduce human lifting. He tapped Suni's narrow shoulder, then his own hollow chest. Her speed, his plan. Suni smiled at being conscripted into a future beyond crisis. She climbed halfway and measured, palms out, spanned between surviving braces. Tala and the drifter sorted through refuse for soundboards. Most had warped beyond salvage, but a section of ladder side and a trough slat still held enough grain. Nay fetched a rusty hinge from a collapsed door frame. They did not ask where to find extra bolts. They shaped a lash frame instead, weaving rawhide around board edges, knotting each tie with doubled loops. The drifter guided with small gestures, economizing syllables. When Suni secured the new vein section into place using the hinge and leather tension, wind bellied it cautious. The head creaked, turned incremental degrees, the stub and new panel aligning with airflow. On the next gust, the assembly rotated a full quarter turn, then another. The rod lifted unassisted a palm's width. Tala quickly matched her own pulls to wind-driven lifts, conserving strength. By mid-morning, the trough held a shallow pool above splinter glean. Silt swirled, settled in thin fans. They took a clean shard and skimmed surface insects away. Not to waste, but to keep the film from thickening. She caught a water boatman and flicked it back. Life selecting this place mattered, but not at the expense of their first clear skim. She filled a small clay cup, water still tasting of iron and rot, but less grit. She set 4 cups out on a plank, one by one, surface vibrating with wind tremor. The drifter accepted his portion last again. This time he lifted it in a slight acknowledgement to the 3 before wetting his lips. He then poured half back into the trough, a tithe to the mechanism or to the day. Tala's brow lifted, question silent. He answered with a flicked look at the channel, at their calloused hands. Investment. Work pivoted to reclaiming interior space. They swept old straw into a side heap for later mulch. Suni stripped splinters from the beam they had used as his prop, smoothing it with a shard of sandstone until a palm could rest without catch. Tala dragged a collapsed rack into light, pulled salvage nails, straightened them between 2 stones for reuse. The drifter sorted his satchel, coil lengths, 3 remaining grease-wrapped bolts, a folded rag. He laid them by function, then gave Suni a sliver of iron soft enough for her to roll between palms into a crude rivet. Shared knowledge became currency traded with no tally. By noon, heat pressed slow. The drifter insisted on testing lift without human augmentation. Tala and they stepped back, arms crossed to hold back, instinct to intervene. The wind caught, new veins swung. Head rotated, rod rose 2, 3 for inches, dropped with a wet sigh, rose again. Flow thickened into a narrow tail, clear at first, turning clouded, then clearing again as silt flushed. Water streamed in a trough, overtopping their shallow lip, running into overflow they had not yet carved channel for. Suni laughed outright, short burst like a bark, and clapped once. No other celebration. They simply watched until novelty folded into baseline expectation. The rig was functioning at a fraction. The drifter sank back, spent. Nay pressed a scrap of dried meat into his palm, then shared the next step by pointing at the dusty strip of ground beyond trough, drawing parallel lines and small X marks. Planting. It was madness in late-season dryness. Yet water made even thin soil a negotiable partner. Tala hesitated. Remaining seed in Nay's pouch could instead trade further down for winter jerky. Nay answered by spilling 5 kernel fragments and 3 intact beans on her palm. Promise of next generation weighed more than trade for immediate meat. Tala nodded once, concession to a logic that risked future rather than starved it. They scraped shallow furrows with a deer rib. Jonah, if he had existed here, there would have been small hands. But there was only Suni, who tamped edges with a solemnity that mocked her years. The drifter watched, then with great effort, using his good leg sideways, pressed his heel into damp soil at each seed, a stamp committing his stored weight to their burial. Tala disguised the impulse to steady him by smoothing soil after each press. Early afternoon, shadow of the new vein slashed long across the barn mouth. A distant dust smear returned. One rider this time, hawk-shouldered, silhouette alone. The sisters tensed. Suni's hand slid to sling. The drifter reached, tapped Tala's forearm, shook head. Different posture. No flankers. She weighed risk, versus exhaustion. They held. Hawk shoulders rode to the perimeter of mud sheen, saw the spinning head, the damp trough gaining sheen at edges. His face held neither scorn nor open threat now. Water had shifted valuation. He sat a long minute, perhaps reconciling a calculus gone against his earlier dismissal. Finally, he raised one hand, palm out, not a truce, more an admission of current retreat. He nodded at Tala, at the drifter, at the spiral scratched in a pump base now ringed in handprints. His eyes lingered at Tala, recognition softer. He turned his horse and left without dust flourish. Desert witnessed, did not applaud. Release came slow, like cooling iron. They did not chase with relief. They simply resumed tasks, Nay skimming, Tala cutting a shallow spillway, Sunni tightening lash knots. The drifter dragged a slat close, picked up a nail, and with awkward, deliberate blows drove it into a support post at head height. He carved into the wood with the bow and all. The spiral again, deeper, cleaner. Under it he cut 4 short vertical marks, 3 close, 1 slightly offset. After a pause, he added a 5th mark of equal height, sliding it closer until the gap looked intentional, harmonious. He pressed his thumb into each notch, leaving faint sweat darkening newly exposed grain. Then he stepped back, breath ragged, and sat. Evening brought a thin rise of mosquitoes over the trough, a nuisance promise. Nay burned dried sage to lay a scented veil. Smoke drifted across the new-planted patch, lending the seeds a ritual they had not requested. Tala cleaned the drifter's wound one last time, finding new flesh knitting at edges, heat cycling lower. She did not say healed. Desert did not bless such declarations. As light fell, Sunni rolled the remaining bread into a tight parcel, set it by his hand, returning gesture from the first night, but in reverse context. He nudged it back towards center of the spiral carving, rather than hoarding. Shared center. Night cooled. Wind eased to a low murmur through the vein. Water kept threading, a softer sound than before, intermittent minor adjustments marking its new normal. Stars aligned a familiar river through the roof gap. They lay not as strangers screening a liability, but as a small unit oriented around a functioning machine and a moist strip of soil seeded with thin hope. Before full dark, the drifter spoke a word, his name, likely, barely more than breath across cracked tongue. Tala repeated it once, anchoring sound in memory, then let silence close back over. Names were less binding here than shared labor. He slept with his fingers curled, not around invisible handles now, but loose, open. The sister's breathing fell into cadence with the soft lift-drop of the rod. Outside, a night bird flew low over the new water, skimmed, veered. Decision to return later marked in wing tilt. The desert had not turned generous. It had accepted a petition, stamped with rust flakes, rawhide, withheld bread, and 3 young women's refusal to leave a half-dead man to sun bleach. By dawn, their seeds would have drunk the first thin wicking of moisture. By next storm, roots could lay soil hold fast. And when future riders drew, near measuring what could be taken, they would see more than a drifter at edge breath and 3 lean silhouettes. They would see motion, blade, water, tending, evidence of bond. Harder thing to raid than static salvage. In the cradle of a repaired mechanism and quiet mutual debts, for solitudes had set posts for a structure no paper would map. Family drawn by necessity, held by chosen maintenance. It began with a drop, with bread left untouched, with 3 gourd rations halved. It would endure so long as someone rose each dawn to listen for the first creak and decide again to stay. If this quiet western struck you, like, subscribe, and tell in the comments which moment held you. First drop darkening dust, mud boundary against riders, or those 5 carved marks under the spiral. Your words keep these stories alive.